Yes, and we're wrong. There we go. So, um, these rail strikes, or should we say the Tory rail strikes, which is what we really have to rebrand them as. And you can see the problem Keir Starmer is having. And I sort of, I'm 50-50 on this, because part of me is like, I agree with the partial strategy he is taking, and we'll get to that in a moment, which is be cautious, be careful. Because if you were to seriously move onto supporting these strikes, how then could Boris Johnson use that against you? And that, of course, becomes the key point. And that is what a lot of people don't really understand about some of these points. Because if you give, shall we say, Johnson the wiggle room to get out, shall we say, of his sticky situation, then this blows any good movement that Starmer could have by supporting these rail strikes. And on the other hand, you've got the situation where he doesn't support these rail strikes, which, again, I agree, for a party called the Labour Party, is very bad for its leader not to be supporting these strikes. And I think Starmer does need to do something. Whether he gives full support or not, he should do something. And this is a classic example of what, again, Winston Churchill said of, in this case, you know, in a crisis, you do the right thing, and that's good. But if you act and you do the wrong thing, that's also good. But in a crisis, you must never not act, or something like that. I believe his quote is, or something like that. But in a crisis, you must be willing to act. And I think this is coming up to the crunch point, because there is so much stuff, so much stuff Labour can really attack the Tories on so many of these points, and they don't. Partly because, as we said at the beginning, they're worried about giving Johnson that wiggle room. And you want a perfect example? Look at what the Daily Mail did. Daily Mail, obviously very, very much a Tory supporting paper, comes out with a front page story saying that somehow Labour, the party that is not in power, the opposition party, is somehow responsible for these strikes. Not only has Labour not been in power, but we've suffered very, very much because of, again, Tory austerity, the fact that they have systematically gone after unions, limiting their power over the years. More, obviously, cutting of the HS2 northern leg, which we've talked about before, how bad that is for infrastructure and sort of the levelling up agenda that Boris Johnson claims that he wants, but isn't really actively engaging in, or at least doing anything about. And then you've got to think about what happened under Corbyn, because Corbyn got painted in such a way that traditional Labour supporters felt that they couldn't support him. And that was down to the fact that, as we've said before, Corbyn refused to play the PR game. And the thing is, in modern politics, you cannot not play that PR game. Because if you don't play the PR game, well then, let's say your opponent starts playing it for you. And they were more than happy to start playing it themselves. As we saw through all, throughout all the Corbyn years, all the headlines, all the saying, oh, Corbyn's a terrorist, or all that stuff we saw throughout the Corbyn years. And that was down to the fact Corbyn did not play the PR game. He let his opponents play the game for him. So, because we have, pardon me, that dog's thrown me off. So it comes back to, what should Keir Starmer do now? Well, I think he needs to act. I really do think he does. And I think in this case, since the opposition have already set out or at least the media has already set out the case of it wants to try and paint the idea that these strikes are because of Labour, then this is the point where Starmer, I think, needs to act and turn around and just say, look, these are not our strikes, they're your strikes. They're Grant Snapp's strikes, they're Boris Johnson's strikes. We haven't been in power, it's because of you guys that these guys are striking. And there is a lot of evidence to suggest and support for the fact that this is part of a Conservative strategy to try and once again re-rally their base back to them ahead of these by-elections and at least almost certainly a potential general election. Like I say, there's been a lot of dates been mooting around, most ominously, of course, October the 27th, being mooted as a potential day at which these, shall we say, early elections could be had. And I want to use an example here of a friend of mine, because he lives in Manchester. He's very much a Conservative voter, although I don't hold that against him. But his tweets very recently, I think, exemplify much of this problem. He basically said, look, I'm not going to vote for the Conservative Party, at least the way it is doing things. As long as it remains like this, I ain't going to support it. I'm like, okay, that's fine. But, and I think this is the key point, this is where I think you see why the Tories are so desperate to tie the idea of these strikes into being a Labour thing. Because he finished off his tweet as he would only support the Conservatives again if it is to stop a Marxist government getting into power again. And yes, we've had those conversations, but yeah, you see the idea of what they want to do now, of trying to say, these strikes are Starmer's fault. If you vote in a Labour government, then you are basically giving power to these, trade unionists. How dare, workers, collectively organise and stand up for their rights. So ultimately, Starmer's in a rock and a hard place, If he acts, he can give Boris Johnson some wiggle room. He can give him ammunition to throw back into Labour, ammunition that we know, unfortunately, works very, very well, unfortunately, against a lot of centre lefties who need supporters, or at least centre right leaning people who are, again, running away from the Conservatives because of how they're acting. And that might bring some of them at least back. But inaction, I think, is also not an option. But at the moment, Starmer might be, shall we say, keeping his powder dry. But the question is, what for? He needs to act. He needs to do something. And I think even inaction at this moment is very worrying. So as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do remember to hit that like, share and subscribe button on your way out. And of course, down below there are links to my Patreon page and a one-off donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can, well, buy me coffee. And as always, thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you all next time.